Dan Schlesinger, Chairman of the Board of Governors.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay in starting. Apparently, my 1,000-slide PowerPoint crashed our system, but the good news is now it's down to a 10-slide PowerPoint. I hope everybody really enjoyed last night, which was a wonderful evening. Thanks to Yossi and the division for putting on a great night for us. And my understanding is that's just a small taste of what's to come. It's become my custom over the last few years as we celebrate our 7 years of centennial from commemorating the 1918 laying of the cornerstone to the 1925 opening of classes at the university. We look back at what was going on 100 years ago. I think it's important to do this not just for nostalgia, but because as we enjoy and celebrate everything that this wonderful university has to offer us, it's appropriate that we recognize the legacy that was left to us by these amazing founders. So partly in tribute to them, let's take a look back at what happened 100 years ago. And I want to, good. I want to focus on the original Board of Governors, which was 24 men. They were European, British, American. I'm not sure whether European includes British these days since Brexit, but hope not to offend any of my British friends in the audience. Many of them were friends of Einstein or Chaim Weizmann. Not all of them, but Weizmann and Einstein did a really amazing job of recruiting some pretty incredible men to help found the university. They were prominent figures in their own right. People who were prominent in academics, in business. There were a couple of rabbis, and really the leadership of the Jewish community, both across Europe and in the United States. Their lives intertwined with each other and in very strange and unusual ways also with us. And I want to talk a little bit about them and how that happened. Although we tend to focus on Albert Einstein and maybe to some degree on Chaim Weizmann as the leaders, as the founders of this university, I want to talk a little bit about some of the people that were a little less well known. Because even though their names are probably not as known to most of us, some of you in the audience I think will know some of their names, but they were really some amazing people. One thing I noted as I was looking at the biographies of these 24 men is being a member of the original Board of Governors was probably a good ticket to living to a ripe old age. Those numbers, for those of you with really good eyes who can see them, are the ages at which these various people died. So you can see, for example, Herbert Samuel lived to 92. Professor Jacques Hadamard lived to 97. And there are a few that died younger, but for the most part, they lived to be ripe old ages. And you can see from the colors that a lot of them lived in more than one place. Many of them were born in Europe and moved either to the United States or to Palestine. Some moved around quite a bit, and I'll talk about a couple of those. I want to just refer briefly to Julian Mack. I talked about Julian Mack in some detail at this meeting 3 years ago. The main reason for focusing on Julian Mack was he was a Chicagoan, and for those of you who don't know me well, I'm a lifelong Chicagoan and very chauvinistic about my city, but also feel like Jerusalem is my city as well. Julian Mack was an incredible person, and as I noted previously, he was number one in his class at Harvard Law School. He founded the Harvard Law Review. He also studied at the universities of Berlin and Leipzig. He founded or co-founded the NAACP and the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which remain today two of the most prominent civil rights organizations in the United States. He was a law professor at both Northwestern University and the University of Chicago. He helped Jane Addams found Hull House. He was a social worker. He was the president of the National Conference of Social Workers. He was the president of the American Jewish Congress. Just an amazing person. And although I talked about him in some detail before, I raise him again because he comes back at the end of this presentation in an important way. So one of the original governors, whose name you may or may not know, is Dr. Cyrus Adler. Dr. Adler was probably the most prominent scholar in Oriental studies and Semitic languages. And he studied at the University of Pennsylvania and at Johns Hopkins. He was the curator of the Smithsonian Institute. He founded the Jewish Welfare Board. He was the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He had a Chicago connection. He was the special commissioner of the World Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair that happened actually in my neighborhood in Chicago back in 1893. And he was the president of Dropsy College for Hebrew and Cognate Learning, which is an institution you may not have heard of. It was at the time the most prominent school for Oriental studies, and it became absorbed by the University of Pennsylvania, where eventually it was renamed as the Herbert D. Katz Center for Judaic Studies. Some of you may recognize the name Herbert D. Katz. He was the president of the American Friends of Hebrew University from 1988 to 1990. Among the great things that happened at the University of Pennsylvania's Herbert D. Katz Center for Judaic Studies is they conferred fellowships on some very illustrious scholars, some of whom have significant connections to the Hebrew University. For example, Professor Edwin Sarusi, a name that most of us know, Professor Guy Strumsa, and a guy that some of you may have heard of, Menachem Ben Sasson, was also a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania Katz Center. Obviously, Dr. Adler had a significant impact on the university, both by being a founder and by the rest of his legacy. A French mathematician was on the initial board of governors, a guy named Jacques Hadamard. I apologize to my French-speaking friends in the audience for my total inability to speak French or pronounce French names. But Hadamard was one of the leading mathematicians of his time. He was one of the two first people to prove something called the prime number theorem, which is important to mathematicians for reasons that I will never understand. He did some of the original research in the field of geodesics. The Hadamard matrix is named after him. He won all kinds of prizes and awards. His cousin was the wife of Alfred Dreyfus. And Hadamard grew up as a very assimilated secular Jew in France. But when his cousin Dreyfus was wrongly accused, he became probably the leading defender of Dreyfus and forced his exoneration and deserves major credit for that. During World War II, he moved to New York and was at Columbia University. He was on the Provisional Academic Council of Hebrew University and really helped establish the mathematics department of the university, which we all know is one of the leading math departments in the world, always very highly rated. And he emphasized the philosophy of teaching applied learning along with theoretical mathematics, which was something of a controversial topic at the time. Another member of the original board was Chief Rabbi Joseph Hertz. Hertz was born in what was then Hungary, became Slovakia, and he moved around quite a bit. He actually grew up mostly in New York. He was in South Africa for a time, then back to New York, and eventually became the chief rabbi of the UK. He was chief rabbi for a long period of time, from 1913 to 1946. He wrote very distinguished commentaries, which many of you have seen, commentaries on the Torah, on the prayer book. He wrote the Book of Jewish Thought. He was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which of course is a conservative Jewish organization, Jewish seminary. But he was always orthodox in his outlook. So although he was a conservative Jew, he was accepted as chief rabbi by the Orthodox community in the UK. He was also an extremely influential Zionist in a period when it was critical to have Zionist representation in England. He really pushed hard for the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and he helped establish the Institute of Jewish Studies and was instrumental in helping develop the Yishuv. The calendar issue that he was involved with was actually kind of funny. There was a movement in the League of Nations to try to change the calendar so that the days of the week would remain the same year to year, so that January 1st would always be a Friday. And what that involved was essentially eliminating 2 days from the calendar, which was and Hertz's approach was to argue that that was a bad idea because it would eliminate both Shabbat and the Christian Sabbath 2 days a year, which he viewed as sacrilegious, and he was very effective in beating down that effort. Another member of the original board was Professor Edmund Landau. He was a German mathematician. He trained and was on the faculty at both the University of Berlin and Göttingen, Germany. He did his own proof of the prime number theorem that we talked about before. His proof was simpler than Hadamard's, and that's a principle in mathematics that you try to get the most simple proof that you can. Landau's function is an important principle in mathematics that's named after him. He was also instrumental in establishing the amazing mathematics department at Hebrew University, and he actually spoke at the 1918 laying of the cornerstone on Mount Scopus. He spoke in Hebrew, which was an achievement because he didn't really speak Hebrew, but he was committed to making Aliyah. He did move to, my note says Israel, he actually moved to Palestine, it wasn't Israel yet, in 1927, and encountered less than hospitable situation in Palestine and at Hebrew University. He moved his family here. His family never really adapted to living in the harsh conditions that were prevalent in Palestine at the time. And he also got caught up in a dispute between Chaim Weizmann and Judah Magnus over various political issues, including who would be the rector. And he decided to, it's a concept that was never repeated. He and his family eventually decided to go back to Germany, and he went back to the University of Göttingen. Like many assimilated Jews in Germany, Landau was a little slow to appreciate what was the gathering threat of the Third Reich. And as one of his biographies states, despite having friends who were well informed as to what the Nazis might do if they came to power, Landau failed to recognize the danger. In 1932, he was visited by a friend, Fritz Rathenau, who told him that if the Nazis gained control, they would build concentration camps in which to put Jews. Landau is said to have replied, "In that case, I should immediately reserve for myself a room with a balcony and a southern exposure." Apparently not quite appreciating what the threat was. Then 1 year later, didn't want to do that. 1 year later, Landau was actually forced out of the university, and he wrote in his memoir, on 2 November about 11:15, "As I wished to leave my office and go to the large lecture theater to begin my lecture, the entrance hall was filled with about 80 to 100 students who let me pass unhindered. In the lecture hall was one person. Clearly, therefore, there was a boycott with sentries at the door who had prevented without force those students who wanted to work from setting foot in the lecture room. What happened, and it happened with the collaboration of many who were my pupils, leads me to believe that the only consequence must be my application to become emeritus or pensioned." That was the end of Landau's career, and he lived out another few years in Germany, but with no real work. Okay, our last slide for today is about Dr. Nathan Ratnoff. Ratnoff was born in Pinsk and then eventually moved to New York, and he formed something called the American Jewish Physicians Committee in 1921. The American Jewish Physicians Committee became the American Friends of Hebrew University. And it always puzzled me why the American Friends of Hebrew University was founded as a physicians committee. I'm a practicing lawyer. I have a lot of respect for physicians. My father was a physician. Some of my best friends are doctors. But I never thought of doctors as the moving force behind fundraising and philanthropy and Zionist causes. And this connects with something that I talked about in some detail last year, which was what happened in 1921 when the First World Zionist Congress in 8 years took place in Czechoslovakia. The conference before that had been in 1913, and then this little war got in the way, and there were no international conferences between 1913 and 1921. And as I noted last year, there was a big rift in the Zionist community, the international Zionist community in 1921, because the Americans, a lot of Americans, were gaining force, both financial and influence in the Zionist community, and were rebelling a little bit against some of the initial founders, like Weizmann. And the American delegation refused to attend the World Zionist Congress in 1921. That rift was international in scope, but it also was notable within the United States. The legal community, behind people like Julian Mack, who I referred to earlier, who was a federal judge, a leader of the legal community, and a good friend of Louis Brandeis, the Justice of the United States Supreme Court, they refused to participate, and they led not only the legal community, but the financial community in essentially boycotting the effort to raise money for Zionist causes, because they felt that they felt very strongly their Zionism, and they wanted money to be raised, but they wanted it to be directed, to have a real plan, and not to be the tradition that had been established by the early founders of Zionism, who raised money and just accumulated it and used it as they saw fit. Brandeis maintained his opposition until there was a resolution in 1930, and that's when the American Zionist Organization of America unified, and both the lawyers and the doctors and the financial people and everybody else got together and became much more effective in their Zionism and in their support of the creation of the state. Julian Mack actually recanted a little bit earlier than Brandeis did in 1930. So by 1925, Mack was part of the mainstream, and that's why he became one of the original governors. Brandeis, to my great regret, because Brandeis was an amazing person who I don't get to talk about now because he wasn't an original governor, he didn't agree until 1930. There are many more great people within the group of founders, and I hope to find time to talk about them at these events in the future, when I know we will all be together in person again. And for those of you who regret having to hear these stories, you brought it on yourselves because you elected me for 2 more years, so I get more chances to talk about this. But I think that's enough for now about what happened 100 years ago. I think I need to turn this over to hear, so that we can all hear more about what's going on at the university today. But before that, let me ask our Director General, Vice President Yishai Frankel, to come forward.
In memoriam I would like to ask everyone to rise, please. Three years passed since we last held our Board of Governors here in Jerusalem due to the COVID pandemic. During these years, we lost dear members of the university community, employees, retirees, and members of our friends' organizations. As the names of our dear ones will scroll on screen, we will stand in silence for 3 minutes commemorating these 3 years, please. Just before you sit down, we were very sad to hear just this morning about the passing of a close friend and dear colleague from our New York team, Jody Perlmuth. May her memory be of blessing to all of us. Please be seated. On a very different note, and with some smiles and some energy, it is now my real pleasure to invite our president, Professor Asher Cohen, please.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Ishai. The Hebrew University has a great legacy, and you all know it. It's the very first Zionist project in the land of Israel, You heard a lot about the history of it from Dan, but generally speaking, it was instrumental in every important event that took place in Israel, including the establishment of Israel itself. Yesterday, you heard the President of Israel, Yitzhak Buzi Herzog, saying great things about the Hebrew University, and we are all very proud and happy with this amazing legacy. The legacy includes the fact that we pursue excellence. Everything that we do, really, is in many ways about excellence in both teaching and in research, and we are very proud of it. And we are also proud of our achievements in all other parts, social, industry, everything that we do. Pride is one of the things, but it also requires responsibility. We are the Hebrew University. We are this institution that is responsible for all of those things, and we have to keep it going. For us, for Jerusalem, for Israel, for the world. And we are committed to do that. In addition to excellence, we are also committed to diversity. We are committed to justice. It's not simple to be committed to excellence and to diversity at the same time. We want to lead, but we don't want to leave people behind. We want to move the entire caravan forward, and we are working very hard on doing so. I'm not going to review all of those things because it's simply too much. We have many years to come that we'll have Board of Governors with live meetings, and I hope, like Dan, to add more things in the future. What I would like to do today is to give you a little bit about the spectrum of activities that exist at the Hebrew University. And the first part of it will be here's the agenda. In the first part of it, we are going to hear several researchers from the Hebrew University, which represent, if you will, the spectrum. We tend to talk a lot about science and technology. But the first lecture today will actually be about history. We have a great humanities here at the Hebrew University, which we are very proud of it. And among our great scholars is Professor Dan Diner, that will talk in a few minutes, that will tell us really interesting, I think amazing insights about the Second World War, right? It's going to be about the Second World War. And he will tell us things that I think will be new to some of us, despite the fact that it's about the Second World War. And that, to me, represents the humanities. After that, Naomi Chaviv will represent, if you will, our basic research. We do lots of things in basic research in the sciences. Naomi is a young researcher and has truly groundbreaking research on Alzheimer. She will tell us a little bit about that so that we will hear about it and we'll see, again, a representation of the things that we do here at this level. We are also proud of our research connection to the industry, what is sometimes called applied research. And for that, we are going to hear Oded Shosayev, who has truly amazing inventions using science to advance applied activities. So you will hear him as well after that. In this respect, you will hear the spectrum of the sciences of our scientific activity, from humanities through basic research to applied research. We are also doing other things as well. As you all know, Albert Einstein is one of our founders. And he left us all of his legacy, including many of his precious documents, 80,000 of them, and many other additional things. Right now, it's located in a small archive here in this campus, but it doesn't really represent well the glorious legacy that he left behind. So I'm going to show you what we are going to do about that. We are going to build the Einstein house, and I'm going to describe it later. And then something about, I don't know if to call it social responsibility or to call it conscience, but you all know about the horrible events that take place in Russia, in Ukraine, because of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. We couldn't do much about it, but we did a little bit that we could, and we invited several academicians and students to come here to the Hebrew University, and we provide for them ability to stay here for a few months and continue their activities in here, and you will hear from two of them that are right here to tell their own story. Then perhaps I'll say a few more things, and I'll conclude my part. So this is the plan for today, and let me start with Professor Dan Diner, a great scholar here at the Humanities, that will tell us the story from his view of the Second World War.
Dear Professor Cohen, dear members of the Board of Governors, dear audience, hardly any other modern historical topic will have captivated people, both contemporaries and those later born, as much as World War II. And hardly any other topic in modern historiography will have been researched with as much intensively. Nevertheless, there is an abiding impression that the war's historicizing, which is to say its transformation into actually completed history, past closed, has not yet fully taken place. Relevant in this respect is the European Research Council Advanced Grant project, meanwhile accomplished here at our university, titled Judging Histories, Experience, Judgment, and Representation of World War II in an Age of Globalization. For this project was focused precisely on transforming the war's past events into completed history. In my short presentation, I would like to highlight two just interconnected dimensions of the much broader project. First, defining the logic of the war, and second, exploring the theme of choice of perspective. In respect to the logic of the war, it seems to us that its contours emerge clearly within the war's worldwide logistics system, especially since that system related all the theaters of war with each other, either by enabling support lines or by disrupting them. This approach, making the network of logistics visible, means, among other things, moving past the usually accepted division between a European continental and a Far Eastern Pacific war. This change of focus allows us understanding the war in its unified global character. In respect to choice of perspective, Ours focuses on a stretch of land on the world map that would initially seem to have little significance for the war as a distinctive global event in history. To be sure, it is a stretch of land that is extremely close to us on existential grounds, namely the place the Jewish community of Palestine, the Yishuv, dwelled on. In our historical account, in the story we are narrating, we draw upon a military geographical approach. We assume that through both political upheaval and an unfolding military dynamic, fixed geographic spaces begin to oscillate. Those spaces, set in motion through military action, seem to expand and to contract, similarly to a living body. The early beginnings of such contractions we see at work in our space of interest in October 1935. The events we are focusing on include, on the macro level, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the so-called Abyssinian War, and on the micro level, an occurrence taking place in Jaffa's harbor, an early trigger of the great Arab revolt in Palestine against the British and the Jewish national home between 1936 and 1939. All of these events emerged in the run-up of the greater wars announcing itself on the horizon. The events prompted the British to distance themselves from their commitment under the Mandate for Palestine, supporting the formation of the Jewish national home there. That reversal is reflected in the notorious statement by then Prime Minister Chamberlain that in face of the upcoming dangers, Britain should be ready, I quote, to offend the Jews rather than the Arabs, which brings us back to the epistemological locus, Jewish Palestine, serving as a pivot of interpretation of World War II. And that epistemological locus is preempted by the question, where from do we gaze at this stretch of land? According to both custom and the layout of traditional cartography, we look at it from a northwestern angle, that is to say, from the European continent, while crossing the Mediterranean Sea. And we consider its logistical access from that direction as well. In the world of yesterday, Jewish travelers from the Russian Empire, hence from the continental East, embarked for Palestine generally from Odessa. For travelers from Central Europe, mainly from the Habsburg Empire, Trieste was the port of departure. In the interwar period, Romanian Constanța, located at the Danube estuary, increasingly served as the embarkation point for Central European Jews to Palestine, mainly from Poland. With the outbreak of the war that soon took on the contours of a worldwide conflagration, the Mediterranean, however, became a battle zone. Civilian travel through these waters was no longer safe. When in autumn 1942, after a long stay in America, Ben-Gurion set off back to Palestine by air, the trip took a good 2 weeks, involving many detours over 3 continents, and few people had that privilege. On the world map, and in those areas accessible to the Allies, Palestine came to lie on the northwest tip of the imperial defense of the so-called southern British world, a defense zone with the Indian Ocean at its spatial center. With the end of the Great War, the later so-called First World War, that ocean had become an imperial inland sea, a British lake, so to say. The island of Mauritius formed the southern British world's topographical center, a relay station for trans-imperial British communication stretching from London and extending to Australia, underwater cables included. In view of those maritime spaces in which the great World War II battles took place, the North Atlantic and the Pacific, the Indian Ocean has very much remained a forgotten ocean. Nevertheless, it served as a global allied logistical hub for all relevant fronts of the war. The Egypt stationed British and Empire troops were thus armed and supplied via the Indian Ocean and its western distributary, the Red Sea. This was the precondition for Montgomery's victory over Rommel's Panzer Army in November 1942. In the Indian ports of Bombay and Karachi, military equipment and supplies were discharged and transported eastward by rail through the Indian subcontinent. From there, via air, over the Himalayan foothills, Chiang Kai-shek, fighting the Japanese in South China, was supplied via Allied bases set up expressively for the purpose. The third support line, which was routed through the Indian Ocean, the so-called Persian Corridor, took on extraordinary significance as a Western Allied artery for supplying the Red Army in its struggle for survival, a logistics enterprise of massive proportions. The supply route through Iran was enormously long and extremely complicated to master. By rail, as well as on specially built roads, bridges, tunnels, endless convoys were sent out direction Caspian Sea. From there, the transports continued by water to the Volga's estuary and onwards to Stalingrad, the transit node of the Western Allies' arming and provisioning of the Red Army. The true significance of the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-43 only becomes clear when we take this logistical undertaking into account. It's a vertically directed view from the south, from the Indian Ocean northwards, and less the horizontal continental perspective from Europe's west to east, which resolves the riddle of the battle. Aside from the especially perilous North Atlantic route to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, the Soviet Union was supplied from American West Coast ports via the North Pacific. Massive American maritime convoys under Soviet flag moved to Vladivostok, unloading cargo there that would be transported westward on the Trans-Siberian Railway. These supplies were in any case basically commodities, raw materials, not armaments as with the Persian Corridor and the North Atlantic route. American manufactured fighter planes were, however, flown to Siberia via the air corridor from Alaska. That Japan allowed shipping convoys for the Soviets to sail so close to its islands on the way to Vladivostok was the result of the Japanese-Soviet Neutrality Pact signed in April 1941. The pact led to both powers belonging later to hostile alliances to refrain from hostilities during the war, and this up to the August 1945 end phase in the Far East. The mystery of that strange constellation is resolved by looking back in time. Yes, Japan and the Soviet Union had already been at war before the World War. In the summer 1939, when they faced off in the far eastern Mongolian-Manchurian border region, a conflict ending with Soviet victory over the Japanese Kwantung Army. The armistice was signed on September 16. The day after, the Red Army marched into eastern Poland, slightly more than 2 weeks after the Nazi invasion of Poland from the west on September 1st. That temporal hiatus is explained by the Soviet war with Japan in the Far East. The connecting space of all war theaters and the hub of Allied logistics in the southern British world, serving us as an epistemological pivot in telling and explaining World War II anew, was facing mortal danger in spring 1942. A hinge of fate, as Churchill dramatically put it. In early May, a British naval formation consisting of an armada of over 50 ships conquered Madagascar's deep-water port of Diego Suarez. The British were here attempting to preempt the Japanese establishing themselves on the Vichy French-controlled island, dominating the Indian Ocean. Following conquest of Fortress Singapore in February, an event initiating the end of British rule in the East, Japan was getting ready to advance over the Bay of Bengal and Ceylon towards East Africa, thus cutting the British World Empire in two. This would not only have managed the logistical routes to the three war theaters, at the same time, the severing of oil and fuel supplies from the Middle East would have interrupted the entire Allied war effort along the lengths from North Africa over India and onward to Australia. The need to supply fuel to the Allied forces in the Western Desert and east of Suez in itself meant that control of the Near and Middle East was an existentially urgent matter. Located at this area's center were the Iraqi and Iranian oil fields and the huge refinery at Abadan. That was a source, not least, of airplane fuel, of kerosene, and a pipeline built in the 1930s leading from Iraqi Kirkuk to Haifa, where a refinery mainly served the fueling needs of the British Mediterranean fleet in the Levant. Because of the facility's strategic importance, German aviators named Haifa die Tankstelle, the filling station. Together with the Italians, these aviators bombed the town a number of times, and they also bombed Tel Aviv. The Axis pressure on British military and supply facilities in the Levant, with the Suez Canal as the center, became enormous. Then, in June 1941, the pressure suddenly abated. The German aviation units had turned away from the Levant, including Palestine, to support the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. Accompanying the turn taken in the Levant was thus the onset of what Churchill would call in real time a crime without a name, what later would be named the Holocaust. With the eastward military shift of Germany and its allies, the shift to the Soviet Union, the Yishuv, Jewish Palestine, had escaped the mortal threat accumulating in 1941, at least at first. But the threat emerged again, this time from the south. This was the summer of 1942, when Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, following the capture of Tobruk and further east of Martha Matrup, approaching the British military port at Alexandria. In Cairo, the British made preparations to vacate Egypt. In July 1st, clouds of burned paper scraps floated over Cairo. Documents deemed secret had been consigned to fire. The day became known as Ash Wednesday. In the Delta area, efforts were undertaken to flood the dams of the Nile. American intelligence officials located there gave the British a little less than a week withstanding excess pressure. The events in the Western Desert would have an immediate impact on Jewish Palestine. The British High Commissioner to Jerusalem, Harold McMichael, invited the chairman of the Jewish National Council, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, to his residence to inform him that were Alexandria to fall, Palestine would itself need to be vacated. Troops and officials would be removed to Iraq and Iran, and if necessary, to India. Bridges and streets leading from Palestine to Iraq would be mined to make the Axis advance more difficult. Panic broke out in Palestine. In several cases, Jews sold their property to Arabs, sought protection in monasteries and hospices, acquired poison. Ideas were developed for Jewish militias to gather on Mount Carmel for a final fight with the Germans. There was talk of a Tobruk on Mount Carmel, of a new Masada, and of Mossadegh, that being a reference to a then much-read novel by Franz Werfel, treating a last Armenian stand against the Turks. But such plans remained fantasies. Such despair notwithstanding, in November, Montgomery defeated Rommel at El Alamein. The German field marshal's tanks had come to a standstill in the desert from lack of fuel. And from the Malta base, the British succeeded in disrupting excess supplies via the Mediterranean. These developments meant the actual end of the war for Jewish Palestine. We see this not least of all in the sudden waning of readiness in the Yishuv to join the British forces. Following El Alamein, voluntary recruitment dropped by 2/3. By a month after the outcome of the Battle of Stalingrad in March 1943, Palestine's compulsory civilian blackout came to an end. For Europe's Jews, however, the war was anything but over. Rather, the Holocaust was moving towards its apogee. In close proximity, in the Aegean operating from Rhodos to the Dodecanese archipelago, the SS executed a deportation of Greek Jews to Auschwitz, even still in July 1944. Since the Italian capitulation, the Aegean stood under direct German rule. A British effort at an amphibious landing on the group of islands in September 1943 had failed in the face of fierce German defense. The British intent had been to draw close to both the Bosporus and the Romanian oil fields. As it happens, this would be the Wehrmacht's last military success in the war. It thus turned out that the last transport of Greek Jews was sent by sea to Piraeus in order to move from there in a long train journey through the continent to Birkenau's gas chambers. This would be the longest single route taken by a murder transport to Auschwitz. Deciphered, a history centered on space, transport, and logistics narrates different Jewish destinies. And it tells us of the massive fateful difference that mobilized brassing military geographical space had ready for those living in the realm of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant. At the time, a 2-hour flight separated Rhodes from Haifa. That much time was needed for Italian bombers, and Germans as well, rising from the island, when in 1940 and 41 they bombed Haifa, and probably due to a navigation error, Tel Aviv. But flight time and routing tell us little about the different fates. What really constituted fate was not the actual geometric distance between Rhodes and Haifa. Rather, it was the fact that Rhodes became located by fate next to Auschwitz, while Haifa became to stay nearby Bombay, so to say. For somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, in the Levant, an invisible line marked the difference between separate spaces. One space became subject to Axis and later German rule. The other space was subject to the southern British world, while Palestine was situated in its northwestern tip. As such, it was under the protection of the British imperial defense perimeter. At those center was India and the Indian Ocean, and from where the empire waged war. In the Yishuv itself, memory of rescue through the Battle of El Alamein quickly slipped into forgetting. The preceding 200 days of fear, from May to November 42, also sank into forgetting's AUKUS. That process of forgetting was favored by a revival of a struggle for the land, a struggle that had abated in 1939 and that would now move into its climax, the year of 1948. This was, to be sure, another war, and thus another history. Thank you.
So, for those who didn't fully follow everything, just imagine that in 1942, here in the land of Israel, there was a very strong sense of catastrophe. And the reason that it didn't happen is because of global issues of logistics that miraculously saved this part and didn't save the part of Europe. Thank you very much, Professor Diener, for pointing out this important thing. I want to move to the next part. I have to apologize. I'm being quite short because of the fact that we lost 15 minutes, so I'm trying to move fast forward. The next research line is going to be presented by Nomi Habib, a young, brilliant researcher that will tell us, I don't want to say much more about it because she can say it so much better. Nomi, please tell us about your research on Alzheimer.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So I'll jump right in to some science from history. And in my lab, we study the process of aging, which occurs over many, many years. And we're interested in the aging process in the brain. So we know that as we age, we accumulate memories and knowledge and wisdom, but we also accumulate damage that leads to devastating diseases, and which unfortunately we don't have cures for. So what we are trying to understand is how can we maintain a healthy brain with aging? And just kind of looking around us, there are actual great examples that it's definitely possible to, and I think looking around also in the university and around the room, you can find many more examples, how people can maintain their cognition and health as we age. So this is our goal, to understand this process actually at the molecular level, so we can take this good examples and generalize it to the entire population. And one of the major burdens is actually Alzheimer's disease, because it's so highly prevalent in our society. So if we're looking with people who have dementia, which means this memory loss and cognitive impairment at advanced age, most of these individuals actually have Alzheimer's disease. And this is a progressive disease, where at the later stage of the disease are associated with the memory loss and the decline. And because it's so prevalent, I think all of us know somebody affected by Alzheimer's. So I don't need to explain much about that side. But I do want to go a little deeper into the molecular side of the disease and show you how we're trying to actually change the way people are researching Alzheimer's, and hopefully will lead to better cures for the disease. On the left, you see a nice image of a healthy brain with a nice network of neurons, which are the nerve cells, which are the most important cells in our brains in the communication in the brain. And when Alzheimer's progresses, there's first an increase in accumulation of proteins called plaques that accumulate in the brain, followed by other types of abnormal aggregates of protein called tangles that occur within neurons. Both of these pathologies are actually damaging these nerve cells, leading to the damage in the connections between them and actually death of these cells. And this is what is believed to be the cause of the clinical symptoms of the dementia. And what you can actually see is that this typical textbook image of the dying neuron surrounded by plaques is only occurring at the last stage of the disease, where typically this is where we're diagnosing people, and this is the stage where we're treating individuals. But in fact, you can see along my graph that there's a large window of opportunities where there is no cognitive decline. There are no clinical symptoms, but the disease is active. This is over 20 years of the disease is progressing. And this, as a scientist, this is actually very hopeful, because we have such a large therapeutic window of opportunities that we haven't been exploiting enough yet. And what we're trying to do is shift the understanding that instead of trying to cure the brain when the damage is so severe, we need to be able to identify and actually stop the progression of the disease from the preclinical stage to the clinical stage of the disease. And in order to do that, we need to actually understand two things. So one of these things, you can see here on the top kind of the classical progression of the disease based on the different pathologies leading to dementia. And what we're trying to understand, what are the triggers that are underlying this progression of the disease. And interestingly, for the majority of individuals, over 95% of individuals affected by Alzheimer's, there is only part of this, of the triggers are actually genetic, meaning something we inherit and we cannot change. And over 50% is something that we can change and modify. It's linked to our lifestyle, like things like diet, and then linked to different stressors that we get from our environment. So what we're doing is we're tearing apart this process by investigating each of these risk factors separately, trying to understand how they're contributing. So our overall approach is that we will be able to find a prevention therapy that would be personalized to each of us based on our own genetic and lifestyle and environment. And today there are actually more advanced blood tests that we already are now these days starting to screen individuals to identify them at the preclinical stage so we can better understand these intricate relations between genetic and environment and lifestyle. So that's one part of this puzzle, trying to find the right risk factors that we need to stop and eliminate. The other factor is much more molecular. We need to understand what is going on in the brain at these early stages of the disease. So for over 30 years, the research has been largely focused on neurons that are dying. But this is the last stage of the disease. So we've been doing something else. We've been focusing on the earlier stages and asking what is happening to other cells in the brain. And indeed, if you look inside the brain, you see that there are many, many different cells that you could see it here at the kind of the edge of my presentation. Okay, not going to touch any of these things. So you can see that surrounding the neurons, there are many different types of cells. These cells are not just there to look nice, they're actually critical for the correct function of the brain. And what we found, along with other labs who have taken this approach, is that these cells that are called, generally we can call them glia cells, like microglia and astrocytes, if any of you have heard these names before, they're the ones to change early before any signs of cognitive decline. So what we did is we actually changed the way people are perceiving Alzheimer's disease. Instead of a disease, the traditional hypothesis saying there's accumulation of plaques followed by tangles leading to dementia, we're saying there is actually a gradual transition in the cellular environment of the brain, which cells and what functions they are at in the brain, transitioning from a healthy state of the brain and the cellular environment all the way to a non-healthy environment that is promoting cognitive decline. So I already told you kind of the main message of what we're seeing, and what we're seeing actually much more than that, because we are now today able to map the dynamics of this process on the cellular level in order to find the initial molecular triggers that are pushing us forward. Okay, so I'll show you, go even one step deeper and understand how can we do that. Okay, so how can we actually map these cellular environments? That's like not very informative, right? What we're actually doing is taking small pieces of brain tissue and tearing them apart in order to look at the individual cell level so we can track the cells along the progression of the disease. So how are we doing that? We're harnessing two very powerful advances that occurred without any connection to Alzheimer's, occurred in the scientific community. One is actually a huge shift in molecular biology, and the other one is a continuous advancement in the computational field. So on the molecular biology side, we're harnessing the huge power of genomics. So we're today in the genomics era. You probably all know that we have in every cell in our body, contains the entire genomic material, the entire genetic code, and how to build an entire individual. This is our DNA molecules. And we are today know how to measure by sequencing, measure efficiently DNA, and how to read that, interpret this 3 billion bases of code. But we can actually do more than that. We can also use the same method to sequence smaller molecules that are called RNA. So why do we love RNA molecules? Because they're dynamic. They keep changing in our cells and in our bodies. And because they're changing, they provide so much functional information. When we're reading the genetic code that's hidden in RNA molecules, we know what cells are doing and what are they doing right now and what are they not doing compared to maybe when we compare healthy and sick individuals. And what we're doing is we're using a specific method in genomics where we're, instead of measuring RNA in entire pieces of tissue, where we can't associate our measurements to specific cells, we're measuring these RNAs in individual cells. So this has been a huge leap in technology because we need to measure less than 10 picograms of RNA for each cell. And another aspect of this technologically is that we need to do this for hundreds of thousands of cells. So we're using microfluidic devices where we're capturing cells in tiny droplets, and we're able to tag them with a barcode and track them over time. So this is the technological breakthrough that is now kind of changing many fields of science, and it's definitely been transformational for us in tracking the progression of Alzheimer's disease. But the meaning of this technology is that we have gigabytes of data. So that's why just the molecular biology alone is not enough. We need to also harness the power of big data analysis that keeps advancing using artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning networks, and so on to interpret the data. Okay, so this is kind of the whole cycle we're doing in the lab, starting from brain tissue, measuring millions of cells, then building maps of the brain, and which gives us new hypotheses to test in the lab for new therapies that we can then look under the microscope. And I'll just share with you kind of two insights that we got from this research before I'll finish. So first of all, we started actually with mouse models where we could quite easily apply these methods and show immediately that our hypothesis that all these glia cells, supporting cells, are changing before any damage to neurons is true. And specifically, we highlighted to the scientific community that a specific cells called astrocytes, or my favorite cells right now, are changing very early in the disease, and we think they might be the key for therapeutics if we'll know how to harness them correctly, which we're working on in the lab. But one of the major challenges has been how to transition from a mouse model to actually studying human brain. So we know the mouse and human are not exactly the same in many aspects. The challenge in studying human brains is, of course, first of all, how do we get pieces of tissue of human brain? And the second is that we're so different. We're different in genetics, lifestyle, environment, right? All the factors I mentioned as risk factors for Alzheimer's. And the answer to that is we had to scale our experiments to look at hundreds of individuals. So here you can see actually what we do. We use post-mortem human brains where we have a lot of clinical information from people who very nobly donate their brain to science. And we just completed a very large, and by the way, these brains that I'm talking about today actually come from Chicago. Yeah. Good. Yeah, and so in a huge collaborative effort that took us almost 4 years to complete, we managed to profile close to 460 donors and over 1.7 million cells. So this is a lot of information that hopefully really profiles what do the brains of aging individuals look like. And we a lot of computational mumbo jumbo, and we reach our maps. So this is just a glimpse into our maps. It looks like continents, but it's actually built of 1.7 million dots, where every dot is a cell, and the colors represent the different cell types and their states and so on. And as I said, I'll share with you 2 quick insights from these maps. So the first thing I'm looking up to see how much time I have. The first thing is that by looking at this map, we actually mapped of the diversity of cells in the brain, right? Which is amazing on its own, regardless of Alzheimer's. And we grouped individuals to different groups based on how do the cells in their brain look like. And we were really kind of happy to see that indeed our hypothesis is we can see it very strongly in the data. We see that brains of people that have cognitive decline, who have dementia, are vastly different than brains of individuals that are cognitively healthy, that do not suffer from Alzheimer's disease. So what we actually showed is we showed that by building all this map and all these cells, we were able to show that the cellular environment indeed is completely different at the beginning of this stage, at the healthy brain, and the last stage of this stage at the Alzheimer's disease. But what we wanted to do is to do much more than that. We wanted to track the dynamics of this process and ask what are the early triggers of this disease, of these changes, right? In order to do that, we actually hit a wall for quite a long time. Why is that? That's because we can't clinically identify these individuals at the early stage of Alzheimer's. Because somebody who is actually cognitively healthy and has a little bit of Alzheimer's pathology, he might be on a fast track towards Alzheimer's, but he might also be resilient. He might live for another, if he would have continued to live, he could have been healthy for another 20 years. Right? So we decided to put aside these clinical data and use only the cells and let the cells tell us the story. So what we did is we built an alternative map of the brain of these individuals, and just based on the changes in their cellular environment. And this is how this map looks, where every dot is an individual, and we see that we are able to map dynamics of the cellular environment. You can walk with me from this right edge of the presentation where the blue people are, the healthy individuals, and there are 2 alternative trajectories. So we found what we were expecting to see, that there is a gradual change in the cellular environment leading to the rapid cognitive decline in Alzheimer's. But we also found something very surprising, that there is a completely alternative route where we can see changes in the brain that is not leading to Alzheimer's at all. It's actually leading to a much more resilient and healthy aging. So we see two ways that people can go. They can go the way we call it, they can go west towards healthy aging or kind of go south towards Alzheimer's disease. And now what we gained is we have a very detailed map, so we can actually say what are the molecular decisions and regulators that trigger the decision to go south or to go west, and how can we prevent people from going south. So that's the end. At the end of all this process, we again have a hypothesis and not a proof, and that's the cycle of science. So we go back to the wet lab in order to prove that, and this time we're using live material, live human brains that we grow, and mouse and human cells that we grow in the lab. And so we have some beautiful pictures from the microscope, but what we're actually doing is manipulating these cells to prove our hypothesis from these maps. So that's the end, and I just want to, before I end, I want to really say a huge thanks to my lab, because science is a real group effort, and without them, can't actually have done any of that. And I'm part of the ELSEC Center for Brain Sciences, which is also a great, great place to do science in. And of course, thank you to the brain donors and to all the collaborators and my funding.
Good morning.
So as you can see, we have hope. We do. And this is really one of the front edge lines of research on Alzheimer. And now, moving to the invention, applied science, from science to the applied world. Oded, please.
Thank you very much. The title of my talk is The Plant Age Materials for the Future, and I hope that by the end of my talk I'll be able to convince you that indeed we are on the verge of the plant age, if not already there. But before I start, I would like to quote the former Minister of Oil of Saudi Arabia, who said something really smart. He said that the Stone Age did not end for lack of stones. And the oil age is going to end long before we run out of oil, and I say for very good reason, because biomaterials are so much better. But that's not good enough to criticize us, the scientists, for not making really good synthetic materials from oil, simply because we didn't have enough time. 200 years of modern science, maybe 300 years if you count for the Industrial Revolution, is not enough time to make really good materials. While nature had billions of years to perfect some of the most amazing materials we wish we had in our possession. Yet, our friends, orthopedic surgeons, always like to glue and screw synthetic materials in our body. And I don't think that this is a great idea, because synthetic materials fail. They fail many times, just like this plastic fork that is not strong enough for its performance. But the fact is that there are really strong synthetic materials. But it's not a good idea to introduce them into our body because their biomechanical properties do not really fit the surrounding tissues, and that's why they fail. But there is even a bigger and better reason for that. And that's, in nature, things are done differently. In nature, no one takes my head and screw it into my neck, or take my skin and glue it onto my body. In nature, everything is self-assembled. Every living organism, whether it's a plant or insect or human being, is made of cells, and the cells contain DNA. The DNA encodes for nanobio building blocks that many times are proteins, other times are enzymes that make other materials like fatty acids, polysaccharides. And the common feature of all these nanobio building blocks is that they don't really need us. They recognize each other, self-assemble into scaffolds on which cells are growing, proliferating, organizing into tissues and organs, and together that's the organism or life. So we at the Hebrew University, at the Faculty of Agriculture, now in my lab, about 70 years ago, we decided to focus on probably the most important nanobiomaterial for us, for human being, and that's collagen. Now, why am I saying collagen? Because we have nothing more than collagen in our body except for water. It accounts for about 30% of our dry weight. So I always like to say that anyone who is in the business of replacement parts for human being would like to have collagen. But admittedly, even before we started our research, there were already in the clinic more than 1,000 medical implants already in the clinic. You know, simple things like dermal fillers to reduce wrinkles, augment lips, artificial meniscus, bone grafts, and even leaflets of heart valves, all made of collagen. Then I guess one should ask me, then why bother? You just said that before you started the research, there were already more than 1,000 medical implants already in the market. Well, the reason is the source of all these collagen products was dead bodies, dead pigs, dead cows, and human cadaver. And that's not a very safe source because they all potentially harbor human pathogens. And indeed, the FDA already in 2007 made a notice asking the companies to start and look for better and safer alternatives. So that's exactly what we did. We cloned all the 5 human genes from human responsible to make human collagen in our body, and using genetic engineering, introduce it into a single tobacco plant. So now the plant that otherwise doesn't know how to make collagen have the genetic code how to make human collagen. Technology was mature. Today in Israel, we grow 25,000 square meters of greenhouses all over the country, from the Upper Galilee in the middle of the country, even in Hatzeva in the southern part of Israel. The farmers receive from the company small tobacco plantlets. They grow them anywhere between 50 to 60 days. We harvest the leaves. The leaves are transported by cooling trucks to the factory in the Upper Galilee where we start the process. Now, if you ever made pesto, you know how to make collagen. Essentially, take the leaves, crush it in some buffer, get the juice, concentrate the protein, then the protein goes to Rehovot, to the science park, where we actually do all the final purification in clean rooms. The end result is collagen, which is identical to what we have in our body, except it's better, because it's not extracted from old used tissue, it's brand new. In addition, remind you that plants do not harbor human pathogens, so it is also safer. And from that collagen, we actually make different medical implants. In fact, 2 already completed clinical trials, got CE marks, and now sold in Western Europe and some other countries. I'm going to share with you the first product that was launched to the market, indicated for diabetic foot ulcers. I don't think that diabetes needs much introduction, except for the fact that today there are more than 400 million people that suffer from that disease. 20% of those will experience, at least once in their life, a diabetic foot ulcer. Now here is the thing. If you're lucky enough and you live in Switzerland, your chances to lose a toe or a foot is about 15%. If you're less privileged and you live in Russia or in India, it's more like 40 to 50%. Number of amputations is huge. 1 million amputations per year, which means that every 30 seconds, someone in the world is losing either a toe or the entire foot. So this is what the doctor is doing, is debriding the dead cells, removing the dead cells, and inject the human collagen into the wound bed. And now something really nice happened. The live cells in the periphery of the wound recognize the collagen using special receptors called integrins, because that's their natural scaffold. And then they get a signal from the collagen, hey guys, you're on the right spot, start to proliferate. And that's exactly what they do. They proliferate, they grow granulation tissue. Once reach the level of the skin, another set of cells, keratinocytes, start to grow and close the wound. This is a picture that we got from one of the medical doctors in Italy that works with our collagen. It's a very tough case of a 62-year-old patient that for 2 years did not respond to any treatment. What you see on the left-hand side is actually a hole at the back of the heel that goes all the way to the bone. Typically, because of the gangrene, this will end up with an amputation. So the last resort, they tried the human collagen produced in the plant. And you can see 3 months later, the guy can play soccer with Messi. Well, Messi is not that a great player, no offense for his fans. So 7 years later, I had a click, and I said to myself, hey, you know, plants, and particularly tobacco plants, are really great because they can produce really complex proteins. Remind you that collagen is a very complex protein. It requires 5 different genes to make a functional protein. So we asked ourselves, what's the next thing we would like to make in plants? And immediately we thought about biological drugs. Typically, biological drugs today are actually made of antibodies, humanized antibodies. Now, fortunately, because of the COVID, you know, everybody are immunologists. I don't have to explain what are antibodies, except to say that they are the guardians of our body. You know, they protect us from infectious disease, from cancer, and so on. So these antibodies, once used as biological drugs, are very, very effective. One example is Humira, anti-TNF-alpha, to treat autoimmune inflammatory disease, such as rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn, and so on. It's really a great drug, except one big problem. It is very, very expensive. The cost per patient per year is $35,000 US. That's a lot of money. So the end result is that only 1 out of 1,000 people in the world that would like to have Humira can afford it. And the question is, why is it so expensive? Well, some will say, well, there are patents. No, there are not patents. They lapsed already. Some will say maybe there is no competition. Well, there is competition. In fact, only in the US there are 2 companies. AbbVie and Amgen produce the biosimilar. And there are another 3 companies in the world. And yet, the price didn't drop by more than 15%. But the reason for that is that produce humanized antibodies, you need very, very expensive factory. They are produced in mammalian cells, which are very delicate, in very expensive bioreactors. So we asked ourselves, if this factory is so expensive, then why produce there? I mean, after all, it's a protein, so it has genes, so let's clone the genes. So we just cloned the heavyweight, the light chain of the antibody, and then told ourselves, well, let's stick it in the greenhouse and produce it at the cost of lettuce or pepper. So that's exactly what we did. So essentially, we took a very complicated factory, and simply by taking genetic information and introducing it into a greenhouse, we've been able to reduce the cost of production by 2 orders of magnitude. And our target is not $1 a day, it's actually 70 cents a day. This is 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than the current price. Just remind you that even a farmer in India that makes maybe $8 a day, he can afford 70 cents. He doesn't even need the government for that. Well, I don't want to leave you with the thought that plants are the only creatures that made great things for us. Insects as well. In fact, this insect, cat flea, has been in my lab for the last 12 years, and I love it because he's the world champion in jumping. You know, these cat fleas can jump as high as 100 to 200 times their height. It's amazing because it's the equivalent for a person standing in the middle of Manhattan in a single jump, go to the top of the Empire State Building. So you can admit that it's really great performance. Well, the question is, how cat fleas do it? Well, it turns out that they developed a very special protein called resilin. And in simple words, resilin is the best rubber on earth. You can stretch it, you can squish it, and it doesn't lose almost any energy to the environment. Everything is kept there. And once you release it, snap, it brings back all the energy. So everybody would like to have resilin, but the question is, how can you get it? Well, one way is to catch cat fleas. Not a good idea because they're jumpy. But here's the thing. I mean, all you need to catch is one, extract the DNA, clone the gene that encodes for the resilin, and get it and stick it into a less jumpy organism, plants. So that's exactly what we did. So now we have the ability to produce a lot of resin. The question is, what can we do with that? Well, the first thing is to change mechanical properties of other things. Like, for example, this cellulose sponge that we made here, with and without collagen, and I'll show you a short video demonstrating what happened. On the right-hand side, you can see a cellulose sponge in water. I squish it, and it has only plastic behavior. On the left-hand side, it's exactly the same sponge, but now with resin. Look what happened. So you can do it again and again and again. By the way, I noticed one funny thing, that whenever it gets to that point, everybody is smiling. And I guess it has to do something with our childhood, maybe the Humpty Dumpty or Nahum Takum in Israel. Except for I found out there is only one country that they never smile. That's in India. I don't know, maybe they don't have Humpty Dumpty there. Well, what can you do with that? A lot of things. We're now working with On. On is a Swiss company that would like to have athletes have better performance. Now, remember the collagen I spoke before. We asked ourselves, what's going to happen if we make a collagen fiber and add to that a little bit of resin? What will happen with the mechanical properties? And sure enough, the mechanical properties were improved dramatically. There was a 380% increase in the toughness and 300% increase in the strain at break. So oddly enough, a patient that will be transplanted with this artificial tendon or ligament will have better performance after the surgery than he had before the injury. So what for the future? I believe that in the future we will be able to produce almost anything in plants. Not just collagen or resin, in fact, everything nature gave us. And we will be able to produce, using sustainable and cost-effective methods, these beautiful materials, and then use modern technologies like 3D printing, and even print a heart. Now, this heart is not going to be as good as we can get from a donor. It will be better, because we'll produce it from better materials. Well, admittedly, heart is going to be still a challenge for many years. But I can share with you that we already made collagen a form which is called metacrilated collagen that can be used as a bio-ink. And we are now using that to print tissues and organs, and in fact we're already in preclinical trials by printing a breast, all biological, produced from the collagen and from the patient's own mesenchymal stem cells. And I would like to wrap my talk by quoting another smart guy, Pavlov, who said, if you want a new idea, you should open an old book. And I say that the book was written. In fact, it was written over billions of years of evolution, and the text is the DNA of life. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. All we need to do is read this text and start our progress from there. Thank you.
I told you that the future is plants. And some other things as well. We got to move forward because we are really running out of time. So let me tell you briefly about the Einstein house. You all know Einstein, the founder of one of the founders of the Hebrew University, maybe the greatest icon of the 20th century, someone that we are all happy to be associated with, and we have his legacy. So we decided to put it in a nice place. And do you want to speak before I present the design or after? Yeah.
You're called whenever you want.
Okay, so where am I going to move it forward? Mayan? זה?
לא. הקליקר, לקחתם את הקליקר?
איפה זה? כן. איפה? Okay. So, what you see in front of you right now is a design by Daniel Libeskind, the very well-known architect who designed this to be our house that is going to be right here in Campus Safra. How do I go back? How do I go back? Okay. So I'm not going to elaborate on it. I'll just say that this is a donation that we already secured, and we are going to build this very nice house in the entrance to this campus, to the Campus Safra in Givat Ram. It will have in there both an exhibition, a permanent exhibition, and adequately enough, it's going to be near the Hebrew University for Youth. So we'll have many, many high school students that can visit and see that, as well as the general public and you. And it's all going to be in this nice house. You see it here. And just one thing to show you is that the upper part, in here, there will also be a nice place for evening events. So perhaps our next event will be there. And Hanoch, we have a treasure here at the Hebrew University. It's called Professor Hanoch Gutfreund. He was a rector, he was the president of the university. I call him citizen number one, and I like to embarrass him because he's Hanoch.
On every occasion, we mention the fact that Einstein was one of our founders, but actually he did something much more enduring for us. Einstein made the Hebrew University the eternal home of his intellectual legacy. And that is a lot. He bequeathed to us all his intellectual wealth, which constitutes today the Albert Einstein archives. The Hebrew University over the years has developed, maintained this cultural treasure and shared it with the world in numerous events. And thus, Einstein's name has become intimately linked with the name of the Hebrew University, and that link is recognized worldwide. Now, it is natural that constructing such an entity, as you have seen, has been for years on our wish list. Now, through the generosity and vision of one of our benefactors, whom you will meet, it is made possible. Now, the Einstein House first will be the permanent home of the Albert Einstein archives. But more important, it will be a unique tourist attraction for everybody, for the young, for the not so young, for the scientific community, for the general community, because within this iconic structure that you saw, the interior is also magnificent. And then we shall demonstrate by authentic documents and demonstrations Einstein's contributions to science, his public activity, his Jewish identity, his connection to the Hebrew University. So this will be something unique. Just I want to mention to our chairman, he always does his historical lessons. There is a great, in the archives, a great correspondence between Albert Einstein and Jacques Hadamard. So I will show you. And now, if I may, to add a personal remark. Having devoted the last 20 years of my life to promoting Einstein's legacy, and particularly the link with the Hebrew University, for me, This is a fulfillment of a dream. Thank you.
And I believe that in 2.5 years from now, this building that you just saw one of its drawing will be here in full. And now I'm going to move to the sad story of our time right now, which is the tragedy that is happening in Ukraine. And as I told you, we couldn't do much, but we did help a few people come here and spend some time here away from Ukraine. And instead of telling you about it, I'm going to invite them to tell their story. Andy, please come here and
Thank you, dear ladies and gentlemen. Before becoming a professor of university, I was working for 10 years in Ukrainian media as a TV producer. And you know what? Now I'm shy to talk to people. But generally, I try to tell my story in brief and to show the great respect and to show the great appreciation for the community and for university. So let me start and to do it. Dear ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, and now I can send great friends. We say in Ukraine, what makes God laugh? Just to tell him about your future plans. My name is Andrei Chuzhikov. I'm ordinary Ukrainian professor of economics, and my story is no better than other stories of Ukrainians scattered around the world because of the war. 3 months ago, I occupied the position of professor at 2 Ukrainian universities. I was attending conferences, I was teaching students, I have 360 of them in both universities. I was building my own business. It was a company, an agency of public communications and public relations. And you know what? In one day, my life plan was collapsed. After 3 months ago, after spending one day in bomb shelter, I decided to evacuate my family and took an assault rifles to defend my city from invasion. You ask me, did I have military qualification? Yes, I'm a military economist. I can calculate the price for gasoline for the tank. That's I can do this good, but still. A month of night shifts, guard duty, cannonades until Kiev was protected from invaders, and I understood that the worst thing I cannot teaching. I have no business, I have no ordinary life, and the science can be forgotten maybe for 3-4 years also. So since that moment, I was anyone but not a professor. Despite of this, I continue teaching my students directly from the place of my military service. Yeah, I do Zoom, and I clean my rifle and then continue lecturing. And after a while, the commander decided that it would be better for me to teach than to undermine military discipline with my computer and lectures. And in general, I don't clean weapons well. That also was his remark. So that is why they allowed me to join the program. I received a letter about the possibility of practicing in emergency aid for researchers and students project by Hebrew University in all early days of the war. And now I want to apologize because at first I didn't believe that someone cared about us and was ready to propose the help. That's true. We expect only for ourselves at the first day of the wars. By the way, the international donors, they say, okay, guys, we don't feel that you survive. We give you 3 weeks. For me, for my colleagues, for everybody else. And by the way, there's someone on the other side of the world understands my situation and offers me a job to save from war. You know, guys, it seems to me I saw this in one movie, one old good movie, to give a job to save from war. Now it's time to say thank you. Thank you to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem to allow me to be professor again, to teach students not to have to sleep in bomb shelter, to finish the school year finally without sounds of the sirens, and to work in grant applications for Ukrainian volunteers to help friends and their families, to work on scientific articles, and at the end, just to drink coffee with new colleagues. Believe me, it's valuable. As an economist, I understand perfectly the amount of emergency and rescue aid that you have spent to Ukrainians, researchers, and students. The only way for me to repay you back is to show my appreciation and to be useful to university and society. First and foremost, through my work and my competence and the work I can do for you. It is really important for me to be useful not only in words, that is why I'm not afraid of most difficult academic work, so I can make papers, I can make applications. So the emergency aid for researchers and students from Ukraine project is an example of true academic brotherhood and understanding that we are not alone. Yeah, that's true, we are not alone. It will take a long time to move beyond the current crisis. I'll become old, I'll become boring, and for the 10th time, I will tell to my grandchildren stories about the war with new fantastic details, how the old people are doing. But one fact they know for sure, the true friends of my family are here in Israel, and we should be grateful for the page of our lives that was written in Mount Scopus. Let me once again express my deep gratitude for the perseverance and hard work you have dedicated to ensure the academic and human values lives on. You're amazing. Thanks.
We brought in not just faculty members, but also students. Dana, please tell us your story.
Shalom, Boker Tov, or it's better to say Tzoharaim Tovim. My name is Dana. My name is Dana. I am a fourth-year Ukrainian student. In a couple of weeks, hopefully, I'm going to become the Bachelor of International Relations, which is pretty sad for me because I got quite disappointed in the international order and international law. From another side, I got inspired and I decided to apply for master degree in international law because I believe that we can achieve the great results. Being a young generation, I possess hope and peace. I would be honest, my dream was always to study in Israel. It all started 2 years ago when I attended Taglit. Taglit succeeded in its mission. I met Yeladim Tovim Yerushalayim. I fell in love in Hebrew language. I came back home. I attended Ulpan, which was pretty boring. So now, thanks to you, I have an opportunity to attend Ulpan in August. And finally, I will stop looking at people asking me something in Hebrew with a smart face and saying, Slicha, ani lo yodat klum, ani lo mavina klum. So I'm working on it, and I believe it's a great opportunity to continue my studying, to continue my research. It's really interesting how it started. 2 years ago, I remember myself being at Taglit, being in Yad Vashem, and afterwards we went to see the graveyards of Israeli soldiers who fell in the wars for Israeli independence. And it was the first time I understood diplomacy is not about embassies, how I was thought about it. I was a second-year student and I thought, I'm going to work in a beautiful embassy, I'm going to promote peace, I'm going to build the beautiful walls. I started to get involved in arms control and non-proliferation. It's still my main focus of interests, but I understood that the world is much more complicated, and something which diplomacy could not prevent results in death of people. I had a kind of déjà vu back in February when I saw it happening in my country. As an international relations student, I learned a lot about wars and military conflicts and terrorism and different kind of, wars and military aggression. But when it comes to a country, when it comes to a home, and you see a family of friends involved, directly or indirectly, when it's out of the class discussions, when it's not in books or in seminars anymore, and it's not just about telling the professors the date when it happened and hoping to pass the exam of history. It's about seeing it in reality. It's becoming kind of devastating issue because you want to be a young diplomat, you want to build the peace, you want to promote it. I always thought, because of my scientific interest, that nuclear weapons are possessing a great threat to people. But it came to my mind that the main threat is lack of humanity, is cruelty, which results in wars and conflicts and deaths. I could not justify the aggression, I could not justify the wars coming place. I understand why they take place, I can analyze it, I understand the roots, I learned a lot about strategic culture. But again, it's quite difficult to think the reality, and you live in a dream, which is kind of nightmare. And every time you get up, you hope that it's going to finish, but it continues for 3 months and more and more and more, and you have kind of devastating feeling. I'm grateful for Hebrew University. I met here amazing friends. I met here amazing professors. I got so much inspiration to finish my diploma. So a couple of weeks ago, I defended my diploma. It was dedicated to Israel-Iran relations, which I analyzed for strategic culture with a focus put on nuclear phenomena. And it was so much inspired by the classes. I took classes on counterterrorism in media, Arab-Israeli conflict, and international relations theory. I'm finalizing my paper about Israel politics of ambiguity. I'm taking the case of Russia and Ukraine war. I'm so much grateful to the professors who dedicate their time to speak to me, to fill the gaps in my theoretical basis and inspire me for new researches. Well, to finish it, I would say that I got so much inspired that I applied for a master's degree in Faculty of Law. So I hope to be accepted. And I would like to express my genuine gratitude. I can say just תודה רבה, but it wouldn't be enough. זה לא מספיק אני יודעת, אבל אני מבינה שאני part of Israel community. אני מבינה I can build my life here, I can promote peace, I can learn a lot because Israel is a great example. And I can come back home and implement it in a real life, something which I'm eager to do. So thanks a lot for this chance, for this opportunity. And that's it. תודה רבה.
By the way, President Zelensky will be talking to the Senate to the General Assembly of the Hebrew University on the 22nd of June. So whoever wants to come and listen to him is welcome to do that. Because we are running out of time, I'm going to stop right here, but just in 2 sentences. What we wanted to show you is the spectrum of activities that we have here. You saw our research in humanities. You saw our basic research in Alzheimer's. You saw our applied research. You saw our involvement in the community with Einstein. And of course, you saw that we are part of the world even in bad times, as we saw in this particular case. And we thank you, Andy and Dana, for coming here and telling us your stories. And now I'm going to turn the stage to Yossi.
My job at the university is to maximize donations and minimize presentations. So I'll try to make mine very short. And I just want to say, as a prelude to the previous speakers, that with your help, we managed to raise $650,000 to help our Ukrainian students. Thank you. So here in 5 or 6 minutes, what usually takes an hour, and you will be hearing a lot about the achievements of this university. Among other things, you will hear that student enrollment is at an all-time high, and I just wanted you to know what the reason is. And the reason is that my 2 granddaughters have already enrolled, and registration opens for the class of 2040. So these are Zohar and Noam, my 2 granddaughters. We have just concluded the best year ever in terms of fundraising here at Hebrew University. And the figures really speak for themselves. $152.5 million for last year. This is an all-time high. This has been a fantastic year, and with your help, we hope to continue the trend upwards. I want to remind ourselves that when Mickey Federman pushed us in 2018 to go for a 7-year campaign of $1 billion, there were very many people here at the university that were quite hesitant, saying that if you move from a 10-year $1 billion to a 7-year $1 billion, it means you move from 100 million a year to 143 a year. And as you can see, we are getting there, and we are getting very close to achieving the 1 billion. And I can assure you that by the end, Mickey, by the end of the campaign, the 1 billion will be there. In addition, there are in the pipeline quite a number of other donations that we will not dwell on, but I just want to touch on 3 points. What has changed? What's changed over the years? So on the left, and you've heard it from me a number of times, donations from Israel and Israeli donors have increased significantly. In 5 years, Israel moved from being market number 7 to market number 2 immediately after the United States, and this will continue. And the figures are impressive. If in 2018 it was $8 million, 2021 it was already $16 million, and it keeps going up. Second, if you move to the other side of the slide, the yellow side, the importance of foundations is tremendous. 67% of our donations during this campaign come from foundations. And you can compare the $63 million in 2018 to the $106 million in 2021. And right there in the middle, and this is really our middle name, we have to look for new connections. We have to look for new people. We have to reach out, and this is what we've been doing. And speaking of our foundations and this impressive number, here is just a partial list of the foundations that have been so generous to us. What is my message for the next year? My message for the next year, there are 4 points in it. We have to continue the systematic surveys of foundations. We are about to complete that process in Europe, but we have to do it everywhere around the world, which is to look in a very systematic way into each and every existing foundation and to find those that are applicable, those that we should approach in order to engage them with the university. Number 2 is we have to continue developing the young leadership. And again, you heard a lot about it. We have, and I'll say 2 words about it, we have to continue sending missions to Hebrew University, and then there's another project that I want to say a sentence about. This is the Legacy Project. Okay, as far as systematic surveys of foundations, we are, as I said, about to complete this in Europe. and there's no substitute to doing it in the most professional way. That is, in each and every country, to take the list of the thousands of foundations and really sort through them and to see which foundations we should approach. I mean, you have a partial list on the screen. For the lack of time, we will not. The second point is the young leadership. And again, what we have done here in Israel in this last 2 or 3 years of the corona was to add a little over 50 young leaders to the Board of Governors as representatives from Israel, including minorities. More than half of them are women, and young, by the way, as far as I'm concerned, is anything between 40 and 55. This is young. And each new member, each one of these 50 chose a topic close to his heart, and we formed 6 groups of lobby for areas important to the universities. These are the areas: sustainability, computational medicine, social impact, diversity in the academia, humanities, and quantum nano. Here are some of the faces that we have added this last year, and you can see that they come from all walks of life, from the media, from business, from medicine, from government service, and this is something that we highly recommend. Our American friends have started doing something very, very impressive, but this should be done, I think, worldwide, because this is the future of the university. Number 3, I spoke about missions. Again, I do urge each and every Friends organization to send missions to the university. There's no substitute. There's nothing like being there, like coming to the university, meeting the researchers, meeting the students, visiting the labs. And here are just 2 examples in the coming months that our American friends are engaged in. Patty Glazer is leading a mission to Paris and then to Israel. At this stage, we already have 37 participants in that mission. And Beno Michel from Florida is leading a mission to Dubai and Israel. And the bottom line is that we here at the university will accommodate each and every delegation, but please be active and send delegations. And last but not least, this is a new initiative that we have embarked upon, and we ask for your participation. The idea is to find in the coming year 100 donors that will, each and every one of them, put his intention in his will, $1 million for the university, I mean, after 120. And you can imagine the meaning of this 100 legacies of $1 million, and I can assure you that by the end of next year, we will be there. So this is the initiative, and I think I want to give the floor for 1 minute to the chairman of our campaign from Chicago. Where else?
Good morning. I hope that you are all enjoying a wonderful and meaningful week in Jerusalem. I'm sorry I could not be with you in person, but I'm pleased to be able to send my best wishes. As chair of Hebrew University's International Campaign, it is my pleasure to be able to tell you about a new initiative that we have launched as part of our Centennial Campaign, a tradition of innovation. The initiative is called 100 Legacies. As we get closer to the 2025 finish line of our campaign, which will mark 100 years since Hebrew University opened its doors, we will work together to identify 100 of Hebrew University's most steadfast supporters and ask each to commit a bequest intent to the university of $1 million or more. Imagine 100 legacies of $1 million can make all the difference towards securing the future of the university in its second century. I am proud to join Einstein, Weizmann, Buber, and other founders of the university by leaving a significant legacy to Hebrew University. It is our turn to take responsibility for the university's future. It is our turn to make history. Please consider joining us. Thank you.
And to wrap up this presentation and this session, I want to call upon the one and only, you should have seen her dance last night.
Well, thank you, Yossi, and I think it's very funny that you just said wrap up, because I'm very passionate about this 100 Legacies initiative, very excited about it. It's something near and dear to my heart. I'm so passionate that I have written a rap, and it goes like this. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, yo, listen up to what I got to say. Hebrew U is calling. Leave your legacy today. We don't think that you should wait to make this part of your estate. A bus could hit you today. An alien could take you away. So it's time for you to mention your testamentary intention. The best bequest that you can give is the 100 Legacies Initiative. Yo. So, if I can rap, you can leave your legacy. I hope you'll be inspired. And by the way, if you can't leave $1 million, leave whatever you can. But this has been something that I've done years ago, and I think it's going to make a huge difference to the university. I hope we're celebrating in 2025, not just 100 members of this initiative, but 1,000 members will secure the future of the Hebrew University with your help. And I hope that over the next few days, you'll make your intentions known to Yossi. Thank you.
And if you can't go for the 1 million, you can go for 2 million. Thank you very much.
Yossi said to wrap it up. I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you very much, and let's move to the next event.